Okay, welcome back. We're in the second part of chapter 3, and we're talking about the history of criminology as a field. And we left off talking about the role of criminology and the role of criminal justice and what it was like prior to, say, the mid to late 1800s. And what we discovered was that crime and punishment was arbitrary, it was brutal, it was inconsistent, and our concept of law and order and jurisprudence was basically non-existent. That changed with the French Revolution, and also with the American Revolution, where the rule of law became an important component um, of modern society at the time, what we consider to be modern society or colonial society. But at the same time that this was happening, we saw another movement in the scientific field, which was the emergence of a new paradigm in the sciences, that of the Darwinian origin of the species paradigm, the idea of evolution and survival of the fittest, as it was applied, studied, and understood in the biological and plant fields. It quickly was incorporated into the social thought of people who were working on philosophers, social scientists as they were at the time, the organization of society. And so what we got in terms of crime and punishment, we saw a shift from focusing on, severe forms of punishment to a system of law and order or a system of jurisprudence. But at the same time, we saw a shift in our thinking from humans as, I don't know what the notion was prior to the French Revolution, but after the Darwinian model emerged in the late 1800s, society and human beings as a species were subjected to the same thoughts and propositions outlined in the evolution of the species. So the idea is that the same can be applied to human beings and to societies about strengths and weaknesses, evolution, succession, adaptation, and we get to a point where, in terms of criminology, we get to a point really of biological determinism. And these next four theories we're going to talk about are theories of biological determinism, where the idea is that criminology or crime and criminality, maybe not criminology as a field, but criminality, your likelihood of committing a crime is in large part determined by some biological processes. All right. So the first of these theories is one of phrenology. And phrenology is an awesome theory for its sheer stupidity. And you may have seen at some point in your life a phrenology head. And I'll give you a picture of one here in a second. I used to have one, a physical one. I don't anymore. So phrenology is a field started by a couple of quacks, Franz Gall and Johann Spurzheim, Austrian, I believe. So what they really believe is that, again, sort of buying into this whole, again, these guys actually kind of predate Darwin, but their ideas are in line with sort of Darwinian thinking. Is the basic idea is that we as humans have different capacities and different potentials, and they are each stored in different parts of our brain. Okay, so our brain can be divided up into many different zones. I'll show you this chart here in just a second. And so depending upon the size of your zone within your brain will determine your propensity toward whatever. How do we determine a person's propensities? Easy. We just examine the bumps on their head. So take a second and just like massage your head. Does it feel a little bumpy in spots? Well, that's something right there. I don't know what the heck that is. And if we were sitting in class, I might have you rub each other's heads, but that might be a Title IX issue. I probably shouldn't do that. Okay, I was joking about that. but so at the time, people thought that, if you studied the bumps on a person's head, that's called the science of phrenology, you could determine what kind of, essentially what a modern day equivalent would be like determine their personality. All right, so let's take a look at the head. There it is. This is a phrenology head. And I'll go down here to my little drawing stick. And so let's see, I used to, combativeness is number 6. All right, so let's see if we can find zone 6 on the head. I have, when this is on the big screen in a classroom, zone 6 is real easy to see. On this screen, it is not as easy to see. Ah, dang it, where is zone 6? This is off. Maybe this is zone 6. You see the two guys fighting? Aha, zone 6. So if I want to determine how combative you are, I might grab you by the head and start feeling around back here in your zone 6. And if I found a lump back there in zone 6, like a bump on your head, ooh, there's a nice bump back there at zone 6, I might conclude you're combative. And if you're combative, therefore, you might be more prone to violent behavior and more prone to criminality. This is the science of phrenology. It's total garbage. But, it's kind of, it's probably no less useful than horoscope. So here we go, number 1. Let's see, number 1 here, that's love, baby. See, number 1 is Cupid. He's got his bows out. So if you have a big knot right back here, maybe it's this side of your head, right back here, that might mean you're a love doctor. I'm just saying, phrenology. Okay, phrenology's, while fun and crazy, completely discredited field of inquiry. The second is one of my favorites. It's by Lombroso, and it is the concept of atavism. In other words, the born criminal. What is atavism? So Cesare Lombroso lived in the 1800s and 1900s. He was a European guy. He was Italian by birth. Studied people all throughout Europe. A lot of work in England, studying criminals. Awesome stuff. So we're going back to this whole idea of it's just straight from Darwin. Criminals are born, not made. It's considered to be a defect in the human species. Okay? And they're considered to be evolutionary throwbacks. Lombroso's words, not mine. So he's borrowing from Darwin in his work. Okay? These are people who have not evolved as well as they should have. All right? They're the weak in the Darwinian concept. And so the term is atavistic stigmata. Essentially what this means is signs of atavism, signs that you were born a criminal. So Lombroso thought you could study people's physical characteristics, all right, primarily in the head and face area, but not exclusively. And so here's what some of them had. Now, this is hysterical because basically, we'll go through the list here. This whole list of features of the born criminal basically applies to every single person on the planet who doesn't have a tattoo. All right, so here are signs you're a born criminal. You have unusually short or tall height. What? So you can be extra short or extra tall. I guess if you're medium height, you're fine. A small and sloping forehead. Wrinkles on the forehead or face. Large protruding ears. Bushy eyebrows. I have seriously bushy eyebrows. I just got these bad boys trimmed last week. Beak nose or flat nose. What's the other option? Fleshy lips, but thin upper lip. I have no idea what that means. A small or weak chin. I want to see this guy. Small head, large face. That would be awesome. Receding hairline. Both of my brothers have receding hairlines. I guess they're criminals, not me, baby. I got a head of silver. gorgeous hair. So my wife tells me. Large sinus cavities and a bumpy face. High cheekbones. Large eye sockets and deep set eyes. Strong jawline. Large incisor. So if you got big teeth, you're a criminal. But my favorite, tattoos on the body is the sign of a born criminal. So I guess if you have tattoos, I do not have any tattoos, but you know, I'm afraid of needles, and I've never really found anything I wanted to put permanently on my body. But if you do have two tattoos, it's a sign that you're a born criminal. Now, I don't know if you're born with the tattoos, or if you just get them later in life, or if there's some sort of magic tattoo gene in your body that just impels you to get that tattoo at the same time you're robbing a liquor store. I don't know. Lombroso's theory. Here are a couple of the drawings from his work of what born criminals look like. Yeah, this guy kind of looks like a creature from a horror movie. Doesn't look human, that's for sure. And then look at the ears on this dude. And you got the shifty eyes, his receding hairline. You know, pretty much half the guys my age have this or worse. So I don't think that's a criminal. Those are some monster-sized ears. I've never seen anybody with ears that big. If we were in class, I would actually try and go around the room and pick out somebody with big ears and make fun of them. We're online, so can't do that. So if you have big ears, this is your lucky day. All right, Lombroso. He also believed that some criminals weren't necessarily born that way, and that there were those who were insane, and they had a brain dysfunction that they had developed over their life. And then there were those whom he called criminaloids, and this is a catch-all category. So what the problem is, where did he come up with these new ideas? Well, here's what happened. So Lombroso wrote his book, and then he went to England to prove that his book was right, and he went to a prison and he started studying all the prisoners there and marking down what they looked like and writing down, you know, their physical characteristics. And, you know, it didn't really take long for him to sort of figure out that, you know, his ideas were bunk, that there were all types of people in prison. There are lots of medium height people in prison. You know why? Because most people are of average height. That's why it's average height. You know, it wasn't you know, if his theory was correct, then the prison should be full of short people and really tall people. You know, jockeys and basketball players. But no, it was full of normal sized people. People with all kinds of facial issues, big ears, small ears, broken noses, small teeth, big teeth, the whole thing. The whole idea was just kind of bunk. So then he sort of later in life decided, well, you know, not all people were born criminal, but that's really what he believed. He was really one of the first and most well-known biological determinists when it came to crime. All right, so we'll skip through this. We've sort of grossly discredited Lombroso, and the field has kicked him around a lot. But you know, every textbook written on criminology has a section devoted to the guy, and you know, it is what it is. All right. Second type is the idea is that body type affects criminality, and okay, you know, let's take a look at what their ideas are. So again, we're talking about people who are highly influenced sort of in the Darwinian way of life, a way of understanding science and society. And their basic simple was that some people had body types that are more conducive to crime. Well, yeah, okay. That kind of makes sense. Let's take a look at what they're talking about here. There are lots of stories, there's lots of lectures in college about body types, right? And there are three primary types that talk about: ectomorphs, mesomorphs, and endomorphs, okay? So ectomorphs are extremely tall and thin people, body type. Mesomorphs are physically well-developed, quick-muscled types. And endomorphs are usually rounder people, but not necessarily lacking in physical muscles or strength. So ectomorphs are believed to burn calories too fast to put on any fat. Mesomorphs have the right balance of fat and muscle, whereas endomorphs put on significant muscle, but they also put on significant fat at the same time. In terms of, just to give you, in terms of athletics, you might think of basketball player, skill player in football or baseball player, offensive, defensive lineman for endomorphs, right? And in fact, okay, I apologize for that. I just had a little choking spell going on. So let's look at mesomorph, Michael Jordan, ectomorph, Sean Bradley, basketball player, and endomorph, his last name is Knighton. He's a nose guard for the Denver Broncos. All three body types, very different. But does it necessarily lead to different levels of criminality? Well, I suppose, that if you were super tall, you wouldn't want to be a criminal because you're easy to spot. And, it'd be tough breaking into places. If you are physically very fit, like the second body type, the Michael Jordans, yeah, I can see where that might make you more physically able to commit crimes, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be a criminal. And if you're an endomorph, if you're soft but non-muscular, yeah, I can see where you probably wouldn't be a hardcore physical criminal. But on the other hand, if you're soft but lots of muscle, like offensive and defensive linemen are, I could see where that, and I could kind of see where that, you could use that to your advantage in a lot of situations. In fact, if you look at, films like The Godfather or Casino or any mafia, Goodfellas, any great mafia movie, who are the rough and tough bodyguards who whack people? They're endomorphs. Luca Brasi was the hitman for the Corleone family, right? Luca Brasi was a big, scary dude. He was an endomorph. He wasn't a cut physical specimen, but it didn't matter. He could mess you up in many different ways. So the idea that body type determines criminality, it's what we call a spurious relationship. It might be that people who are more physically fit are able to perform crimes of a variety than people of other body types, but it doesn't mean that body types determine criminality. So that theory's been bunked. The next one is feeble-mindedness, and this is less tongue-in-cheek. So I kind of made fun of the other two theories, but I don't make fun of this one, the other three theories. Feeble-mindedness is the idea that criminality and degeneracy is inherited. And this led to a dark, scary place in our society in the early 1920s. So the concept of feeble-mindedness has been with us for the longest time, but it really started to gather attention in the late 1800s. Again, highly influenced by Darwinian thought on human evolution. Okay? There were two books written, one called The Jukes and the other called The Kallikaks. Henry Goddard wrote The Kallikaks and is probably the more famous of the two books. And The Jukes and The Kallikaks they are nonfiction books. They are biographical accounts of two families. The Jukes were a family that lived in upstate New York. And what the author had noticed is that the family tended to reproduce generation after generation of degeneracy. In other words, things like petty criminals, people who had bad work histories, family that lived in severe poverty. And the idea was that it wasn't the social conditions that these people were born into that ultimately led to their living a life of, petty crime and alcoholism, etc., but that somehow they had the magic here, this yellow, degenerate gene. Okay? This is biological determinism. The idea is that people's criminality, their poverty, their vagrancy, what have you, is somehow part of their genetic code. This is where the Darwinian idea comes into effect. Because at the time, the field of eugenics, the field of genetics, we started to understand the field of genetics better, and a movement about how genetic makeup affects human behavior. It's called essentially the field of eugenics. And it began to dominate scientific thought early in the 1900s and up through about World War II. There were still eugenicists employed at universities. But during the early stages of eugenics, it became the hot new science. And I've got a film you have to watch. But it's some crazy stuff. It was so controversial by today's standards. But at the time, it was an easy solution to a difficult problem. And that problem was, what do we do with poor people and people who can't take care of themselves? And the Nazis in Germany took the field of eugenics, which started in the United States, it's our baby, and they applied it to their own citizens. And they developed something called the T4 program, in which they would put people who were considered to be unproductive, they put them to death. So if you had a child who had cerebral palsy, under the Nazi Germany, they would be required to be euthanized under the T4 program. Yeah, horrible, horrible stuff. If they were going to be a drain on the state, they would put them down. All right, the Kallikaks, the better known of the books. Martin Kallikak was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. And I have to say, I have something in common with Martin Kallikak. Kallikak was a scoundrel. He had two families, which was not as uncommon as you think during that era, without telephones and communications and stuff. So he soldiered in the Revolutionary War, the war ends. But during the war, he had a family back home, but during the war, he had met and started having children with another woman who was, single at the time. And so the Kallikak line, the original family he did, had a line, a list of ancestry that was successful. People who did well. So his children with his first wife did really well. Their children did very well. Their children did very well. Okay? They had successful careers and families and the whole good thing. But keep in mind, Martin Kallikak didn't tell his first wife about the second family he had. He never divorced his first wife. He lived with her after the war and, raised the family with her. But at the same time, he had already produced children with this other woman that he had met while he was away fighting the Revolutionary War. That family line turned out to be very different from the original Kallikaks. This was a family line of paupers, vagrants, criminals, women who had in turn had illegitimate children. So the natural conclusion here, from a 2020 perspective on this is that, the environment in which the second family children were raised, no father, probably in poverty, begat their own children to live in the same circumstances. And the children from the first Kallikak family, the original Kallikak family, grew up in relative affluence, and their children grew up in affluence and got the advantages of that, and so on and so on and so on. But that's not what they concluded back in the day. Henry Goddard didn't conclude this. Goddard was a big part of the early eugenics movement, by the way. He concluded that somehow a feeble-minded gene had been passed down through one line of the Kallikak family, but it had missed the other line of the Kallikak family. And that there was a degeneracy gene out there that if we didn't stop it from being passed down and being passed on to the next generation, was a possibility that we could all wind up at some point, all of us could be feeble-minded, because at some point we would have inherited that gene. You may have seen, there's this, what's that stupid movie? about the guy who goes to 1,000 years in the future, and there's gosh, I forget his. And he's this average. He has an average IQ, and he's the smartest. Idiocracy. That movie, Idiocracy. So the idea is that if only stupid people continue to reproduce throughout time, then their stupid genes get passed on, and eventually all the smart people get pushed aside, and we wind up with a society of idiots who do things like use rubber bands to tie buildings together. I don't know. It's a movie, but that's not how genetics works. All right. So this is Goddard's conclusion in 1914 in his work on feeble-mindedness. It said, every feeble-minded person is a potential criminal. This is necessarily true since the feeble-minded lacks one or the other of the factors essential to a moral life, an understanding of right and wrong, and the power of control. All right. Okay, welcome back. You've watched the Buck versus Bell film, and what that film shows you is that basically sterilization became law of the land. Buck v. Bell has never been overturned. It is still the law of the land. In fact, 6 years ago, women in the California state prison system were sterilized because the state decided they were not worthy to have more children. So what Buck v. Bell does is takes this concept of biological determinism to an absolute extreme. And the idea that all antisocial behavior is genetically passed from one generation to the next, and that the way to eliminate antisocial behavior is to stop the reproduction of the people who have the degeneracy gene. Now, science will tell you there is no degeneracy gene, and none of this is all bunk. But it emerged out of the evolution movement and the work of Darwin and the work on the origin of the species. And the idea was that somehow the people who had the degeneracy gene, you could spot them because they were the vagrants, they were the poor, they were the paupers, they were the unwed mothers, etc. They were the criminals, had to be stopped and eliminated. Otherwise, our society would only get weaker and die off. That's what the Nazis did. They adapted, as you saw in the film. They really loved the work of the eugenicists and that group up in Cold Harbor, New York. And they even gave one of the guys a medal. Good God, a Nazi medal. Wonderful. But yeah, so this is where it went. Now, again, this debate still comes up. This is, while most people understand it, there is no such thing as this degeneracy gene. Every now and then, the eugenics movement will raise its ugly head again, where you'll hear things about biological determinism. And as I said, Buck v. Bell wasn't a particular controversial decision. It was 8-1 in favor. The quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes, something about 3 generations of idiots is enough, is god awful. And as you saw, Carrie Bell's daughter was anything but an imbecile. She was a B student. Her antisocial behavior, she was in elementary school, God forbid, she had passed notes back and forth to another person. What this story doesn't tell you, I've read the book Imbeciles, which is the story of the Buck v. Bell decision, is that the reason why Carrie Buck never finished school, she had been adopted by a foster family. She had been put in foster care because her mother, had a drinking problem and had some illegitimate children. And the state took her away and put her in foster care, which was probably, the right decision. But the foster family who adopted her didn't adopt her because they loved her, because they were willing to help her. They adopted her because they wanted free labor. And what they did was they adopted her, and her role was to clean the house for the family that adopted her. Okay, that's bad. I get it. But then it got worse. They are having financial problems. And so in order to solve their financial problems, they took Carrie Buck out of school. She was in high school. They took her out of school, and they made her work for other families in the town. They hired her out as a maid to other families in the town. They did not do this with their other children. She got pregnant because she got raped by a cousin of the father, the man in the foster family that adopted her. And he raped her and got pregnant. And when she was pregnant, they decided they couldn't keep her anymore, and they kicked her out of their house. And so they put her. They didn't. She didn't have anywhere to go. She was a minor, and so they stuck her in the Virginia Institute for the Epileptic and the Feeble-Minded. Because if you were a girl who was 16 and was pregnant during that era, you were considered to be feeble-minded. And they also, at the time, epilepsy was a disease people didn't really understand, and they thought it was also part of the degeneracy issue, and that's why they put them together. That's just kind of an aside note. But just to let you know the rest of the story about Carrie Buck is that, she wasn't a degenerate. In fact, later on in life, when they finally closed that place down, she lived for quite a while. She was actually she held many jobs quite successfully, and worked, I believe, as a social worker at some point in her life, helping children and families in need. But she wasn't an imbecile. She wasn't feeble-minded, although, of course, the Supreme Court ruled that she was. And it was all driven by this really Darwinian approach to antisocial behavior. And was that people were born bad or with some sort of biological defect, and that the species needed to identify the genetic lines and stop them. And one way to do that was to sterilize the women who were, propagating this line. All right, let's move on to a couple other ideas in this chapter at the end here. Okay. So, as a sociologist, we look at we're going to argue that crime is not a biological factor, but it is a social consequence. That there are social patterns to crime that lead to higher crime rates, that lead to criminality. And so probably the earliest sociologists who studied crime, and the two most important ones, first is Gabriel Tarde, which is a fairly good name, but the biggest name is a guy named Emil Durkheim. And Tarde, again, lived through the same era that the other writers did. He was, sort of part of that Darwinian era writer, but he rejected these biological theories. And he thought, like many sociologists today, that criminal behavior isn't inherited, but is learned. We learn to become criminals because we associate with criminals. That's how you learn to become a criminal, is by associating with criminals. And so one of the ways to stop crime is to get people to stay away from criminals. Okay, that's sort of a basic behavior pattern today. Think about it. As a parent, you worry about who your kids are hanging out with. When your parents worried about who you were hanging out with. Okay, don't hang out with the bad crowd. Why do we say those things? Because we know that criminal behavior is learned behavior. All right. So in the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the social psychology of crime, and then move on to the 4 basic theories of criminology. We're going to talk about modern day theories of criminology. So we're going to stop right here. Y'all have a great day.